Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica Sayer. I'm the horticulture agent in Harrison County, and I will be speaking today. And then we have one of our other hosts is Adam Lamberger. He is the Franklin County Extension agent for horticulture. So he will be kind of moderating today and letting me in and kind of checking off attendance and monitoring the chat box and whatnot. So Adam, do you have any thoughts before we get started?
No, just a reminder to everybody to make sure that you mute your mute your mic and turn off the video to make sure that everybody has good bandwidth still on it. Also, if you can, put your name in the chat box just so I can help me with attendance.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again for, like I say, for joining us. Some of you might have already been involved in this series that we did from January to March. So thank you for those that are returning. And if you are new to the series, welcome. All of these are being recorded and they will be available at on our web pages. So like for the Harrison County Extension web page, you can go to the horticulture tab and find the previous recordings. And that can be done with Harrison County, Franklin County, Woodford, and Bourbon County. So they should be available. What we've been doing for those that are new, the 3 classes that are taught in April, those videos recordings will be uploaded at the end of April. We do have the previous recordings posted. So if you missed anything, if you missed between January and March, feel free to join by looking at the recording. So we appreciate your attendance and we will go ahead and get started. So today's topic is one that is of interest to quite a few people. We get quite a few questions about this in the office, and that is vegetable gardening in containers. So most of us are probably familiar with vegetable gardening in raised beds or conventional gardening, but we just want to talk today about some options for raising vegetables in containers. So why container gardens? They work well in small spaces. So maybe you don't necessarily have a yard that you can till up or put a raised bed in, but you still want to grow vegetables. So the opportunity exists for you to do that in containers. And I apologize, allergies are bothering me today, so I might take a couple breaks to swig some water, but works well in small spaces. It's an opportunity to try out different varieties. So maybe you don't necessarily need a whole row of a certain type of lettuce, but you want to try out a certain variety of lettuce. So you could plant just a specific container with that lettuce in it, and that would be something to try out. Gardening in any form, including container gardening, is a form of recreation. They can provide ornamental value. So a lot of times when we think about container gardening, we think about planting flowers in there, but you can actually, use the vegetable plants as an ornamental value as well. So on your porch, you might have, a container of petunias, but you also might want to have some, cherry tomatoes growing there. So that's an opportunity as well. Another thing that could be the situation where you live is you might have different microclimates where you can place containers in different locations. Maybe you have an area that would be great for a garden in the ground, but it's way too shaded, but the space is right. But you can't grow because it doesn't get enough sun. So maybe you don't necessarily have a place that you can till up, but you have an area that gets a lot of sun that you could grow in containers and still get those vegetables that you're growing yourself. So this is going to be, this is a publication by the University of Kentucky, and I just want you to be aware of it. I went ahead and shared it at the beginning, that a lot of the information that I'm sharing is coming from this. This is it's not a new publication that's recently been revised, and they are available now at your county extension office wherever you live. So be sure to stop by and get one of those. And then this is also the link. And I will tell you, I know a lot of times people are watching these Zooms and you might be trying to take notes and whatnot, I can send a copy of the PowerPoint out later if you would like that, just so that you don't have to write everything down. You can have access to it later. So, but this is going to be something that we refer to quite a bit. Okay, so whenever we are thinking about container gardening, the container is very important. So almost any type of container can be used as long as there are drainage holes. Drainage holes are going to be very important because we need that water to escape in the ground. That happens naturally. So we need to kind of mimic that in the container. When you're thinking about the size, most vegetables need at least 6 to 8 inches deep of potting mix for their roots to grow in. All vegetables are a little bit different, but that's just to give you kind of a starting point. When you're thinking about the size of the container, the bigger the better. So vegetable plants take up a lot of room potentially. So just some thoughts here. Peppers are expect 1 to 2 gallons of dry soil or dry potting mix per plant. Cucumbers 4 to 5 gallons, and lettuce 6 to 10 inch diameter pot. And while we're talking about that, and on the next slide, I've got a picture that I think will help. But when we say gallons, we're talking about like a nursery stock pot. Not like a gallon of milk, that's liquid. This is gallons from a dry perspective. So not necessarily something we've always talked about, but in horticulture, that terminology is used. So that's something that you need to be familiar with. So to the right on your screen, there is some tables that you might find helpful, the types and sizes of growing containers and the pot size and capacity. So if we are saying peppers are 1 to 2 gallons per plant, then you can also look at the diameter at the top, and that might help you when you're looking out in your garage or your storage building or you're shopping for containers. That chart might help you kind of narrow it down a little bit. So going along with that, I found these 2 pictures that I feel are very helpful because like I say, we use the term gallon in horticulture, and most people think of that as a liquid measurement, but in horticulture, it can be a dry measurement. So you can see the sizes there, 7 gallon, 5 gallon, all the way down to a pint. If you have ever gone to a nursery, garden center, anything like that, and purchased either a container tree or a container shrub or perennials, you've probably seen these types of labeling before, but in case you aren't familiar with it, this just hopefully can give some perspective. A lot of perennials will come in a 2-quart pot or a 1-quart pot or a 1 gallon pot. So it's very different than liquid measurements. I just want you to visualize that so you can see what we're talking about on these charts. By the way, if you have questions as we go throughout this, just feel free to put those in the chat box and we will address those at the end. This is a pretty good little chart to go by. If you've never done vegetable gardens in containers before, it is nice to have a reference as to how big the pot needs to be. If you've never grown that particular vegetable before, you might not necessarily know how big it gets either. So this is kind of a little cheat sheet that is the just container size for vegetables. So cabbage, for example, for a 2 gallon size pot, you can grow 1 plant. For leaf lettuce in a 1 gallon size pot, you can grow 4 to 6 plants. Now, this again is just a general guideline. Different varieties that you grow can potentially get different sizes. Not all cabbage gets the exact same size. Not all eggplant gets the exact same size. So think about that whenever you are deciding in a container as well. But again, this is a good starting point for you. So whenever we are thinking about, we've got our container chosen, we've decided kind of what we're going to grow, or we're thinking about what we're going to grow, we need to consider the potting mix that is going in that container. So whenever we're doing container gardening, remember we want to have drainage holes because it's going to be important for that water to be able to leave the container just like it would in the soil naturally. But we never want to use 100% garden soil in our containers. It just doesn't work well. It is not the same type of environment that garden soil is used to. It's not going to drain as well. It can cause some problems. So we don't want to use all garden soil in our containers. We would prefer to use a soilless media. So that's going to be something like in this bag that's on the wheelbarrow. Okay, something just like you would grow or put in your containers for flowers is going to be the same for vegetables, but something, a soilless mix. So it's going to have peat moss, it's going to have probably perlite in it, it could have vermiculite in it, it could have some compost in it, it might have some slow release fertilizer in it. There's lots of different options on the market. There's lots of different price ranges on the market. You can get as simple or as fancy. But you don't want just pure compost. You don't want just pure garden soil. You want a potting mix. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking for. Because with a container, we need to have good drainage, but we don't want it just to all wash out before the roots can even take it up. So we need a good combination of good drainage without draining too fast. And those pre-mixed bags of potting mix are going to allow for that. You want it to be well aerated, which again, a pre-mix is going to already have that perlite in there that's going to help with some aeration. It's going to be lightweight. Which is a good thing when you're working with it and moving bags back and forth. It's fairly lightweight because we want those roots to be able to break through any of that mix that's in there. Where if we have actual soil, garden soil, that can get really compacted in a container. So using purchased bag mix, or if you're doing a lot of containers, you can mix your own. There are many different mixtures that you can find in gardening publications and books and online. Feel free to experiment with those. It just kind of depends on your budget. It kind of depends on what you want to do. The easiest, most convenient is by far to buy a bagged mix. But if you're doing a lot of containers, then sometimes it's easier to buy in bulk and then mix that yourself. It's going to be a personal preference on that. So when we are planting in containers, we're going to use the soilless mix, and it's recommended anytime you're using that to actually moisten that mix prior to using it. This says the day before you use it, but it could just even be the hour before you use it. But the peat moss, which is going to be your primary ingredient in a soilless mix, it has a tendency for the water just to kind of run off of it. And if you've ever mixed soilless mix with water, you have seen this before, but it takes a while for that peat moss to absorb. Peat moss is made up of dehydrated bog plants. So literally they've been so dehydrated that it's going to take a while for those water particles to merge together and to hold into that mix. So takes a little bit of time. You can do this, dump it out, pour it in a wheelbarrow and mix it up with a hoe, a big bucket or whatever, or even on the ground. If that's an option, just put a tarp down or something like that. But if you want to moisten it the day before, or at least prior to using it, that way you know that it is good to go. It is absorbed that water. And then whenever you are planting and you go to water, you've already got some water in the mix. That's going to help the roots get started. And the first time you water, it's not just going to run out the bottom. It's actually going to stay in the mix for a little bit to allow those roots to the opportunity to take that up. So that's really important, is to moisten that mix before you use it. Just a little side note, the peat moss that's going to be your primary ingredient in the mix, If you have access to hot water or warm water as opposed to cold water, it actually will soak up hot water faster, which is a good time saver. And it also is helpful on your hands, because I'm usually the one, like, not necessarily using tools, but I'm in there with my hands mixing it together. And it's kind of like baking and kind of like working with dough. But your hands will be really cold if you use cold water. So warm water is helpful for the hands, as well as it soaks it up faster. So it's a win-win. But you're going to fill the container all the way full, basically. You want to leave just about a 1/2 inch from the top that is vacant of the mix, but you're basically filling the container all the way full. The picture with the terracotta pot there in the middle, you can hopefully see on your screen. Half of it is been pre-moistened of the peat moss, and half of it has not. And this is what it will look like if the bags have been rained on, then you might not have to add as much water, but a lot of times they've been sitting in a warehouse and it's super dry, and it might take some time to moisten it. But you want your soil, and I say soil, but your soilless mix to look like the right. You want it to be a little bit damp whenever you go to use it, not super dry like it is on the left side of the pot. Okay, so whenever we actually are going to plant in our containers, we can do a couple different things, and it kind of depends on what you're growing. We can do direct seeding, or we can work with transplants. So direct seeding in containers or in your garden, regardless, direct seeding means you are putting the seed in the container and that's where it's going to stay. Okay. We're not going to like grow it in a little pot and then transplant it later. That's transplanting. That's indirect seeding. We are talking about direct seeding. So this is more common probably in conventional gardens than container gardens. Things like peas, things like green beans, those are going to be things that you would direct seed. So if you are doing this in your container, as always, you're just going to follow the seed pack instructions for planting. It might tell you to cover with a 1/4 inch of soil, or to cover with 1/8 of an inch of soil, or whatever the case may be. Just follow the seed packets for instructions. With containers, you might want to sow the seed a little bit more thickly than what might be needed, because some are not going to germinate. And you can always go back and thin out if you have great germination, you have too many, you can always pull some out later. We want to label with our variety and our date of planting, so we have an idea of, on your seed packet, it's going to say days to germination, days to harvest, things like that, so you can have an idea of when things are going to be ready. And it's seed, it's covered. You don't necessarily remember which red pot you put, the peas in. So like it's important to label because we're not seeing anything above the ground yet. We want to water seeds gently. If we put too much water pressure on at one time, those seeds can wash away and move around, and you've worked real hard on your placing, and we don't want to mess that up. So we want to water them because they're going to need water to germinate. But it needs to be done gently. After the plants have 2 to 3 leaves, after they start to emerge some leaves, then you can thin those out. And that's what I was saying. If you have really good germination, then you might need to, you've got too many for the pot. So whenever they're small, you can pull some of those out and they can just be discarded, or you can try to plant them in another container. And then that's just going to allow for the proper spacing. Depending on what you're growing, you might need to stake the plants. 1 inch of mulch can be added to the soil surface, just like kind of around the top of the container, and that can help maintain your moisture. So if we're not doing seeds, if we're growing from transplants, so somebody else has seeded them or you have seeded them, and then you're going to plant them in your final container. You're going to plant vegetable transplants in a container just like you would normally in a garden bed. Tomatoes, however, and this is kind of the same as with a garden, but tomatoes, you want to make sure place tomatoes 1/3 deeper, okay, so that media is covering some of the stem. Tomatoes have a tendency to be very tall, to be very lanky. Excuse me. And so we can actually plant those deeper into the soil than we can other plants. Other plants, whatever you take it from the container, you want it to be equal to that in its new container whenever you're transplanting. But tomatoes, we can go deeper into the soil than they were originally at their soil level. We want to water these in thoroughly. And again, as before, just like with your X seeding, if they require staking, we want to do that if necessary. And you can also add mulch to help maintain some moisture in those containers. Okay, so this chart is, I think, very helpful. It is actually from this publication that I mentioned at the beginning. I just pulled out a few of kind of the more common plants that you might grow in a container. Crop selection is important with container gardening. Just like we choose, maybe the varieties that we really enjoy to grow. We want it to be something that we like. We want it to be something that tastes good. We want it to be something that we've had success with in the past. But there are specific varieties of vegetables for containers. They can be grown in the ground as well, but sometimes plants that we would traditionally grow in the ground can become a little too wild or a little too big for a container. So there have been cultivars that have been kind of narrowed down to these do better in containers. So this chart shows a few. And as I mentioned before, I can send you the PowerPoint so you don't have to worry about writing all this down. But for example, beans, there's going to be some different varieties there that are listed, and those are just been shown through research that actually do well in containers. Tomatoes at the bottom, I know that's a really popular one. Those 4 varieties that are listed there are some varieties that are listed specifically that do well in containers. And that's important because tomatoes are one of those plants that can get pretty wild and they can get pretty big. These varieties, you might not necessarily be able just to go to a general garden center and find them, unfortunately, but they are going to do better in containers potentially than some other varieties. So that might be something that in your seed catalogs you can order from. So just something to think about. But those are just a few examples. There's a much larger chart in that publication that I referred to. All right, so after we have everything planted, we're going to need to care for our plants because we want them to be successful. So in containers, it's important to remember that containers are going to dry out quicker than whenever we have an actual like conventional garden. In a conventional garden, you have the soil there. The roots can extend to reach for water. If it rains, then the water can stay in the soil for a little bit, for long enough for the roots to pick it up. Containers, that's not necessarily the case. They're not going to be able to hold in as much moisture because just the space is not there to do so. So we're going to have to water them. They might get rained on and that'll be great, but you are going to have to water them and monitor them. So we want to keep the soil moist, not wet, but we want to keep the soil moist. You can let it dry out between waterings, but if we let it get too dry, then those roots can really, it can really not do good things for them. They're just going to dry out to the point that they can't really suck up any more water. So we want to keep it moist. We want to water thoroughly. So if we think about whenever it rains or if we are watering our own garden, we always say to water deeply and infrequently. So not necessarily watering constantly, but we want that water to go deep into the soil. And that way we're going to get a stronger, longer root system with that than watering shallow. If we water shallow, our roots are going to stay up here all the time, and we're not going to have as successful of a crop. So whenever we're talking about containers, we want that water to go deeply as well and very thorough. So we want to actually water until we see the water come out of the drainage holes at the bottom. That is going to signify that we have watered enough, that we have watered so that it has made it all the way through the pot, so that we know that all of the roots then have received that water that they need. In the summertime, you might have to water up to twice a day. If you've ever grown vegetables in containers before, then you know this. If you've ever grown flowers in containers before, you know this. They just dry out quicker. You've got the wind that's going past the pots. You've got the heat coming in on all sides of the pots, and it just dries out the soil quicker. So we just have to water more often. If you have a large setup, you could invest in something like a drip irrigation system, where you would have little tubes that go to each individual pot, and you turn on the water at one source, and it takes the water to all of those pots. Most of us are not going to be in that situation, but it is out there if that's something that you want to, experiment with. Whenever we are watering, one thing to keep in mind is we want to avoid wetting the leaves when possible. So, and people will say, well, they get wet whenever it rains, but we also have additives and things in our water that isn't necessarily in the rainwater. And anytime that the leaves are wet, it is an opportunity for disease to come in. So if we can prevent that, then we're good. So if you have your plant, we recommend watering around the base of the plant. So not necessarily just overhead, but for my plants, a lot of times I'll actually lift up the side of the leaf and then water into that container, just so, because we need the water to get into the soil. We don't have to have the water on the leaves. We need it to get into the soil because the roots are what take it up. So if we can kind of move the leaves out of the way, water directly onto that soil surface, then that's going to be the best option when that is an option. Protecting plants from high heat, light reflection, severe rain, and windstorms. So high heat, like I said, those containers are going to get a lot more hot. They're going to dry out a lot quicker whenever there's heat. Unlike the soil, like in the ground, where you have kind of an insulation layer and it's cooler underground. So we don't have that with containers. So we want to think about that whenever we're placing them. Severe rain and windstorms, they are going to have a possibility that they'll flip over just like your patio furniture or anything would. So just keep that in mind whenever there's going to be storms coming through. One cool thing about containers is if you have some early crops or some summer crops, you can actually, when those are done, you can pull those out and you can reuse the container to grow some fall crops. So it's an opportunity, just like a regular garden, it's an opportunity, to extend your growing season. Okay, and when we're dealing with vegetables or any plants, there's always going to be insect and disease pressure, unfortunately. And we live in a climate where insects and diseases are they just love us here. So we need to be scouting for that. Okay. So just because you grow in containers doesn't save you that opportunity, that doesn't save you from the insects and diseases. It's going to be just like a regular garden. You can choose plants that are more disease resistant, which we always recommend to look at disease resistant varieties and to choose those things. But it's inevitably going to probably happen on something that you have. So the best way is just to scout, to look. Look at them daily. Look at them daily when you are watering. Don't just go out and blindly put some water on and move on. I know we're busy, but if you want them to be successful, then if you catch it early, it's kind of like if you get sick as a person. If you catch it early and get treatment early, then you're probably going to be in better shape and feel better sooner. So if we catch insect and disease sooner, then we can hopefully get rid of the issue sooner. So we're going to need to scout daily for insects and diseases. After we see that we have something, we need to correctly identify it, because until we can treat it, we can't treat it properly if we don't know what it is. So we want to correctly identify the pest. You can do that through, your own knowledge or books, or the internet can sometimes be helpful with that. You're of course welcome to call your extension agent. If you don't have a horticulture agent in your county, then your agriculture agent should cover those questions. And we can help identify that pest, whether it be an insect or a disease. We can help identify it correctly so we know the plan of action to take care of it. If it's an insect, then we're talking about treating it. If it's a disease, then we're talking about let's help prevent it from affecting more of the plant or spreading to other plants. So identify correctly, and then we can treat it. Always making sure that we follow the directions on the labels whenever we're doing any type of chemical or any kind of treatment. So hopefully we won't have too many insect and disease problems, but we can never rule those out completely. So if we scout and find them early, then that can help. So continuing on with caring for your plants, fertilizing is one thing that you're probably going to need to do. Whenever we are growing out in the ground, traditionally, your soil, whether you've put fertilizer on it or not, there's going to be some nutrients for the plant in the soil. Some soil is going to have better nutrients than others, but there's going to be something there. In a container, that's not the case. We're dealing with, prepared potting mix that could have fertilizer in it, but a lot of times containers will require more than that. So a lot of times there will be slow release fertilizer, which is what the top picture is, those little yellow green beads. They're not always yellow, it depends on the brand, but they can be different colors, but they're going to be little beads like that. And those are called a slow release or time released fertilizer. And what it is, the little beads are made up of fertilizer. And every time you water and as they break down, they break down and it releases the fertilizer into your mix, and then the roots can then eventually take it up. So it is very slow, but it works really well in containers because a lot of times it'll be good for like 3 months, 3 to 6 months, something like that, which is around the time that you're going to have those containers out. So that is definitely an option. It's in a lot of potting mixes that are already on the market. More and more are having that's already in them. So triple 10 and triple 14, those are just a couple of examples that are oftentimes used. And then this particular slide, 1/2 tablespoon of fertilizer per 1 gallon of mix is a pretty good rule of thumb recommendation. So there's also the bottom picture is water soluble fertilizer. So this is going to be something, this in the picture, we can't promote brands, but just to give you an idea, the bottom picture is something like Miracle Grow, that blue color. The top picture is Osmocote, which is a really popular brand of slow release fertilizers, but there are a lot of other options on the market. So not promoting that, just trying to give you a name so that you can have an idea of what is out there, what you're looking for. But the bottom picture is water soluble. So it's kind of like sugar, like whenever you put it in water and you mix it together, it will dissolve. And that is going to pack way more of a punch than the slow release fertilizer. Slow release fertilizer is great. And I highly encourage you to use that whenever you are planting or if it's already in your mix. But sometimes you might need a little more nutrient value. So that's when we can use a slow release, or excuse me, a water soluble fertilizer. And that can start being applied mid-season. A lot of times people will do it like once a week or every 2 weeks. And that's just you're gonna just kind of need to monitor your plant with that. Just some examples. Peters is a brand name of triple 20, Miracle Grow 15, 30, 15. Those numbers are important. And just a little quick lesson on that. Those three numbers are going to be on any fertilizer. That first number indicates the percentage of nitrogen that is in that product. The second number is the percentage of phosphorus that's in the product. And the third number is the percentage of potassium that is in that product. So whenever you see those number dash number dash number, that is your fertilizer analysis. So if you think I need more nitrogen, then you could go for the first number being higher than the other two. So we can start applying and then apply 3 weeks after plants have 2 sets of leaves. So not just the little tiny babies, but after they've got a couple sets of true leaves on them, then we can start adding that water soluble fertilizer. Sometimes if we put that on too soon, it can burn your roots, and which can be a negative. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want to kill the plant. We want to feed the plant. So you can, a lot of people will use a combination of these 2 types of fertilizers for containers. I'm trying to switch to the next slide, and my computer is not. There we go. Okay. So a lot of people, I'm just throwing this in here because a lot of people really like to grow tomatoes. That's probably the #1 thing that is grown. So just some tips, because tomatoes can get out of hand really quickly in the garden as well as containers. So first, consider using varieties that are disease resistant. Second, in containers, consider using varieties that are specifically for containers that have shown to be very successful in containers. And then to go along with that, if you have standard size tomatoes that you are growing in containers, so not just the little cherry tomatoes, but a standard size tomato, they can get large, they can get heavy. So some things to help with that. You can use a stake or like a tomato cage and actually put the tomato cage in the pot to help keeping the vines going upright, just like you would in your garden, because tomato vines are going to go everywhere. We don't want them on the ground. They're going to get stepped on. They're going to get damaged. So we want them to be upright in that cage so that they can kind of hang over into that cage. You can also, in your garden and in containers, you can prune your tomato plants, which some people refer to as suckering. You're going to be removing the small shoots that form in the axils or the joints of the leaves and the stems. And that's not all of them, but some of the small shoots that you can remove. And that can help give you fewer stems, but stronger stems, and fewer but stronger stems can give you larger, better quality tomatoes, rather than a lot more tomatoes with worse quality. If you are staking them, I recommend the tomato cage, but sometimes it's not an option. Maybe the store is sold out. Maybe they don't, it's not, you just have some tobacco sticks that you want to stick in. That's okay. If you use a stake, you want to tie them up to the stake, obviously, but we want to tie them loosely. We don't want to tie them so tight that in human terms, it cuts off the circulation. Okay. We want to tie them loosely so that the plant can still grow, so it can still move, so it can still get air, so it can still get all of that stuff. So just keep that in mind, because that is a really easy thing to do, is to tie it too tight, and we don't want to do that. Some, just throwing this out there, some people like to do recipe container gardens. I think they're really cute. I think they are very decorative, and there's a lot of good benefits to them, but there are some things we need to keep in mind. So whenever we are mixing a lot of different plants together, we need to think about their growing requirements. And a pizza garden sounds awesome, but the plants that you put in the pizza garden, let's say you've got tomatoes, you've got peppers, you've got onion, you've got basil, you've got, all these different things. First of all, they might not all be growing at the same time. Second, they might not all require the same light. They might not all require the same water. So that's going to be something that you need to think about, because like I say, a pizza garden sounds really cool, looks really pretty in these pictures, but it's not always super practical. So just be thinking about that. So if you want a pizza garden, maybe consider putting your tomatoes and peppers, maybe instead of one pot, maybe we have multiple pots and we just kind of group them together so that it looks like it's kind of like that middle picture. We can kind of have a display, but it's not necessarily all in the same pot, because if it's all in the same pot, you might not be as successful as if it was different, because your tomatoes, for example, are probably going to need more water than your basil. And if you have that all in the same pot, that's not always easy to control. So having multiple pots, you can still do a design with those multiple pots to make it look really pretty and to still get to your end purpose. So that is the last slide of information. Wanted to share with you the sources that I used. One of them is this Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky, ID 128, new publication or revised publication. It's available online, and it's also available in hard copies at your extension office. So you can stop by and get one of those. The hard copy is really nice. It has a lot of, I refer to it all the time. It has a lot of really good information for both beginning gardeners and experienced. And I also found some good information from Iowa State's Extension Service. Thank you all for joining us today, and we appreciate your attendance and hope to see you again next week.